The coming Shabbos is going to be Shabbos Shira. Shabbos Shira is a beautiful Shabbos because the theme is the theme of song, and the reason for the theme of song is because it's Oz Yashir. So we've got the story of the splitting of the sea, the drowning of the Egyptians, and then following that, the Jewish community gets to go Bar Mitzvah. Oh, there we go. So you know, it's not an easy haftarah. That's right. That's exactly right. Exactly right. So Shabbos Shira, 100% right. So Shabbos Shira is named such. It's fascinating because we don't name the Shabbos over the miracle of the splitting of the sea. We don't name the Shabbos over the fact that the Jews were now totally free, because up until the point of the destruction of the Egyptian army at the sea, they actually were not fully free. We name the Shabbos after the Shira, after the song of celebration and gratitude that the Jewish people gave to Hashem after they came out on the other side. So the Rebbe asks a really interesting question. We know that as a general rule, the Haftarah is always supposed to match the parasha. The reason is because there was a time in history where it was forbidden to learn, to read the Torah on Shabbos. So they took passages out of the Tanakh and they used them as an alternative, but it always carried the same theme as the parasha. So you've always got to look, anytime that you come across a Haftarah, you have to ask yourself, what's the link between this Haftarah and the parasha that we've just read? So because the Shabbos is called Shabbos Shira, Shabbos of song, it's not surprising to us that the Haftarah is a Haftarah about a song. No surprise, because the parasha is about this great song, Oz Yashir, which is such a profound song of gratitude that we included in our davening every single day. And in fact, there's a saying, I think it's from the Arizal, that says, if you say Oz Yashir with joy, then your day will be a joyous day. So it's a big thing. No surprise then that the Haftarah is a Haftarah of song. However, I'll tell you what is surprising about it. Nobody stops to think about this. The Rebbe raises the question. Nobody stops to think. In the Tanakh, there's more than one song that is recorded. For example, if you have a look at the Haftarah that we read on Shvi Shel Pesach, the 7th day of Pesach, which is the date of the time of the splitting of the sea. So the Torah reading then is the same. It's not the full parasha of Beshalach, but it's a good portion of Beshalach, and it's the splitting of the sea, and it's Oz Yashir. There, the Haftarah that is chosen to match the song is a song that was composed by King David. But this Shabbos, the Haftarah that is chosen is Vatoshar Devorah. Okay, the different versions, how much of the story of Devorah you read, but fundamentally it's the story of the song of Devorah. Now that's fast forward in history because that's at the time of the Shoftim, the time of the judges, in between the leadership of Yehoshua and the time of the establishment of a kingship in Israel. So there were Shoftim, there were judges who led the Jewish people. Different judges behaved differently. Not all it wasn't homogeneous, not like kings, where every king had exactly the same levels of authority. The Shoftim were different. And Devorah was this unique case of a female shofetes, of a woman who judged the Jewish people. Fascinating. And there are many, many things to consider and to discuss about the fact that there was a woman who led the Jewish people, and what it means. Anyhow, at that time, the threat came from a fellow called Sisera. Sisera was no friend of the Jewish people. He agitated against the Jewish people. And Hashem sends a message to Devorah, who was a prophetess, that they should lead a preemptive strike against Sisera, which they do under the directorship of Barak. And it would appear that Barak was Devorah's husband. And what happens after that, it's a miraculous victory. There's certain echoes of the story of the splitting of the sea in the story of the destruction of Sisera. 600 chariots at the sea, 900 chariots of Sisera. All of his people drown. So it's a similar story, you know. People on chariots drowning in a miraculous fashion. And at the end of it, Devorah composes this beautiful song of praise to Hashem. And it's that song of praise which we choose for the Haftarah for this Shabbos. So now you've got to ask yourself two questions. One is a generic question. Why is this song chosen to be the Haftarah for this parasha of the song? And the more specific question is, this parasha is the song Oz Yashir Moshe Uvenei Yisrael, a song that was led by a male, Moshe Rabbeinu. He was a man. Or Bnei Yisrael and the children of Israel, but Bnei Yisrael more specifically is the sons of Israel. So the anchor theme of this parasha is a song that was sung by men, and the Haftorah, which is ostensibly supposed to reflect the same theme, is the song of a woman. So while that might seem like just splitting hairs, what's the big deal? This was a song of praise, and that was a song of praise, but these things are very carefully chosen, very carefully. And if you're going to have the song of Moshe in the parasha, you would expect the song of King David in the Haftarah. So why did they choose the song of Devorah? Now, there are various explanations that are given. For example, I'll give you one interesting explanation, very interesting explanation, and that is that if you take a look at next week's parasha, you've got the story of Yisro, Moshe's father-in-law, returning after having been in Midian, coming to join the Jewish people. Now, when he comes to join the Jewish people, he brings Moshe's family with. Because when Moshe went back to Egypt, Aaron told him, why are you bringing more people into slavery? Send your family back home. So he did. He sent his wife and children back home. And so next week's parasha, they come back to join, which means that Moshe's wife, Tzipporah, clearly wasn't there at the time of the splitting of the sea and did not share in that great celebration, that miracle. Which means that when the Jewish people sang to thank Hashem for the great miracles that he did, Tzipporah was not there. She did not have the chance to sing that song. Now, one of the interesting things about Hebrew language is that there are various ways that we connect words in Torah. Various ways. One of the ways is called atbash, which means if a letter is the last letter of the alphabet, you can switch it for the first letter of the alphabet. Another way that we connect things is by sound, so words that sound the same. And another way that we connect is called the Hey Moitzo'oi Sapeh, which means that there are 5 different components to speech, and all letters that are formed using the same part of the mouth, they have a relationship. So for example, certain letters are formed with your lips. P, B, M, right? So those are the letters that are interchangeable. Certain letters require the throat, like ches or ayin, if you pronounce ayin appropriately, like we're supposed to. So those letters are interchangeable. Some come from the palate, right? Like k comes from the palate, right? A chof, which is not as harsh as a ches, comes from the palate. Gimel comes from the palate. Some require the teeth. Shin, sin, right? T, they require the teeth. And some require the tongue. Lamed, right? So those letters, different letters that are formed by different parts of the mouth, they're related to each other. So if you take the name Tzipporah, tse and de, right? Both the tongue, tse and de. So they are interchangeable. P and b are the lips, they're interchangeable. So Tzipporah and Devorah are actually effectively the same name. And so it emerges, according to some commentaries, that Devorah was the reincarnated soul of Tzipporah. And because Tzipporah wasn't present at the time where they sang to Hashem, after the drowning of the Jews' enemies at the time of the Yam Suf, at the time of the Red Sea, so therefore she comes back as Devorah, who sings a song of praise to Hashem at the time of the drowning of the enemies of the Jewish people in a different period of history with Sisera's army. Okay, interesting explanation. But the Rebbe takes a different angle, and the Rebbe says, if you look in the parasha, it is true that Oz Yoshev Moshe, that Moshe led the men, and the men sang praise to Hashem. That's all true, and that is the bulk of the song of praise in the parasha. But immediately after that, you see something else. What does it say straight after that? It says that Miriam took musical instruments, tambourines and whatever else, and she gathered the women, and the women had their own celebration to thank Hashem for the miracle. And the minute you examine it, you will see something fascinating. You will see that the women, 2 things. Number 1, their song of praise was more joyous than the one of the men, which leads us to point number 2, that they were more prepared for the celebration than the men were. Because it says they had tupim u'mecholos, various instruments. They had tambourines and whatever, flutes or whatever it was that they had, in order to be able to sing praise to Hashem. So the men only sang, but the women sang and played music, which implies that there's something about the women's song that is more powerful than the men's song. And it's because of what's more powerful about the women's song, that's why the Haftarah is deliberately chosen to be the song of a woman, because there's something more dynamic and something more powerful about that song than even what the men had. So we've got to ask ourselves the question, what was unique about the women's song of praise to Hashem that makes it greater than the men's song of praise to Hashem? That's what we've got to ask ourselves. And in order to answer that question, we'll have to focus on two things. One thing we'll have to focus on is how actually were they prepared with instruments? What made them think? Here you are, you're packing up your home of 200 years. And it says, Bechipazon. There was a lot of pressure and rush to get out of Egypt in a haste, in hurry. That's why the matzah didn't rise, and so forth. But you have the presence of mind to pack musical instruments. So what's that all about? That's the one angle. And the other angle that we have to think about is, you always feel simcha relative to how much anxiety or how much suffering you experienced beforehand. So the moment you see that the women express more simcha or greater simcha than the men do, immediately you have a hint that there must have been something about the experience of being in Egypt that was tougher on the women than it was on the men. So once we unpack those two principles, we'll be able to understand why the women's joy is so special that it gets unique attention and spills over into the Haftarah. And then, of course, it must teach us some kind of modern-day contemporary lesson as well, which, please God, we'll begin to examine tomorrow.